All right, so you're ready to take the plunge into English. We're talking about the language spoken by like a quarter of the entire planet, right? That's 2 billion people, so pretty big deal. It's definitely a world of possibilities waiting to be unlocked. And we're diving into the essentials you need to know, kind of like your starter kit.
Yeah, and what's really cool about the material we're looking at is it's all about getting you using English like right away, not just stuck memorizing a bunch of rules.
Okay, so let's say you land in a new country, everyone's speaking English, and you're like, okay, I want to jump in. What's the first move, according to what we've got here?
It actually says to put down the grammar books, at least for now.
Whoa, really? Hold the grammar.
Yeah, the real key is to start by tuning your ears. Like,
Yeah.
just listen to the rhythm, how it all flows, even if you don't get every single word at first. Kind of like, when you hear a catchy song, you start tapping your feet before you even know the lyrics.
Ah, so it's about absorbing the sound first before you dissect it. Kind of like how we learn our very first language as kids, right?
Right, exactly.
Maybe, but I'm guessing at some point we need a little structure. What about this backbone the source keeps mentioning?
Right. So the backbone of any language, it's the sentence structure. And this source, it breaks down the core of English. It calls it the S plus V plus O pattern. So subject, verb, object. It's how you build clear sentences that people actually understand.
Okay, I got to admit, that sounds kind of technical. Can you give me an example? Something that's not in the source, something I'll remember?
Sure, let's see. How about the hungry traveler devours the delicious pizza?
All right, I see it. Traveler, that's our subject. Then devouring, that's the action. And the pizza is, well, it's getting devoured. It's the object. Okay, it's almost like a simple formula. But to use that formula, we need the words, right? What kind of vocabulary building blocks does the source give us?
It gives you a real toolbox. It's got, well, first you've got nouns, right?
Yeah.
So the names of things. Book, city, friend.
Okay, the building blocks, the things, the people.
Right. Then you've got your verbs. Those are the action words. Walk, laugh, learn. And then, of course, you've got your adjectives. Those are the words that describe things like funny, bright, delicious, just like that pizza we were talking about.
So even with just a handful of these like starter words, you can start putting together simple sentences and actually express yourself. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And as you go, as you listen and you practice more, you'll naturally pick up more and more words. It's like your toolbox keeps expanding.
Okay, but I got to be honest. Even if I have like the sentence in my head and a few words, the idea of actually speaking out loud, it's kind of nerve-wracking. What does the source say about tackling that fear?
One of the best tips it gives is to, well, embrace the idea of mimicking.
Mimicking what, like a parrot?
Not exactly. Find, a native speaker you enjoy listening to. It could be from a movie or a podcast or even just an audiobook. And just try to imitate their rhythm, the way their voice goes up and down, their intonation.
So it's not about erasing your own accent, but more about capturing the music of the language, right?
Exactly. It's a really fun and effective way to um, loosen up, get comfortable with the sounds, and just sound more natural.
I like that. More natural, not like I'm reading from a textbook.
Yeah, and one thing that I found really encouraging in the source is it really emphasizes that, especially when you're starting out, clarity is more important than perfection. It's more important to get your meaning across than to worry about sounding like, I don't know, a newscaster or something on your first try.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so let's say I have worked up the courage to actually speak. What are some of those like first phrases, those hello world moments that I should have ready?
Just like any good intro, you need those essential greetings. The source covers those basics, like your trusty hello, the good old hi, and then your time-sensitive ones like good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.
It's funny though, even with those simple greetings, there's this sense of like formality in English that can be tricky. Is that something that the source touches on at all?
Absolutely. You wouldn't, greet your boss the same way you greet your best friend, right?
Definitely not.
It's all about understanding the context, knowing when to be more formal and when to be more casual, and then adapting your language accordingly. It's a nuance that definitely takes time to master, but this material lays a great foundation for understanding these subtle, differences.
Okay, so let's say I've nailed the greeting, maybe a good morning to the barista. What comes next? This is where I usually freeze up.
Don't worry. The source gives you the classic follow-up, how are you?
Ah, yes, the classic, how are you? But isn't that a pretty personal question?
It is, but here's the interesting thing. It's not always a deep philosophical question.
Oh, really? So what's the deal with how are you?
Often it's just a polite formality. People expect a simple I'm fine or I'm good in return, even if you're having, the craziest day ever.
So it's more about the social dance than like spilling your guts.
Yeah.
That takes some pressure off. All right, so I've navigated the greetings, the how are you. What about actually like having a conversation? Where does the source take us from there?
So we've laid some groundwork, but we both know actually speaking a new language, it can feel like a pretty big leap.
Oh, totally. It's like, okay, I understand the theory, but my tongue just like gets all tied up in knots when I try to actually do it. So what does the source say about, bridging that gap?
Well, one thing that really resonated with me is they emphasize starting small. Don't pressure yourself to be like totally fluent overnight. Just focus on mastering a few of those basic
Yeah, I think
phrases.
those like greetings and how are yous that we talked about.
Exactly. Build that confidence with those little victories.
I like that those I can actually do this moments.
Yeah.
But practicing alone, it can get kind of stale. What about, finding someone to actually talk to?
Yeah, the source definitely stresses that finding a language partner or a tutor or even just a friend who's also learning English. It's all about having someone to, bounce ideas off of and get feedback, and most importantly, to actually practice those real life conversations.
I've even heard that, like having imaginary conversations can help, just talking to yourself in English, pretending to order food or ask for directions. Might sound silly, but it gets those words flowing.
Yeah, and what's really cool is that the source points out all the amazing resources we have these days, with technology. Think about it. Language learning apps, online communities, you can even just watch movies or listen to music in English. It's all about immersing yourself as much as possible.
Right, like surrounding yourself with it. Even if you can't just, hop on a plane to an English-speaking country.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm practicing, I'm immersing myself.
Yeah.
But what about those times when I inevitably make a mistake? I think that fear of messing up, that's honestly like the biggest hurdle for me.
This is where I think the source's advice is really spot on. It literally says, don't be afraid to make mistakes. They're a natural part of the process.
Right, but how do I actually move past them, especially with things like pronunciation?
Well, the source gives this great tip. Become a language chameleon. Mimic native speakers.
Okay, so we're back to mimicking, but this time it's about pronunciation.
Yeah, exactly. Pay attention to how they stress certain words, the way their tone goes up and down, even how they kind of connect words together.
It's like learning to play an instrument.
Yeah,
You wouldn't expect to sound like a pro on your first try, right?
right. It takes
You
time.
have to practice, listen carefully, and eventually you start to get it.
Speaking of listening, that's another key skill the source emphasizes. I mean, you can't have a conversation if you don't understand what the other person is saying. Right.
Oh, tell me about it. I've had those moments where I just like smile and nod, hoping I haven't agreed to something totally crazy.
Mhm.
But seriously, how do I get better at actually understanding what I'm hearing?
They suggest becoming a language detective. Focus on the meaning of the words, the context. If you hear a word you don't know, try to piece together the clues from what comes before and after it.
Ah, like a puzzle.
Exact.
But what if the other person's talking super fast? That's when I totally lose track.
Simple but effective suggestion from the source. Slow it down. Whether you're listening to a podcast or a video, or even just, a recording of yourself practicing, adjust that playback speed.
Oh, that's a good reminder. And I know subtitles can be a lifesaver, especially when I'm watching movies or TV shows.
Absolutely. Use those visual cues. As you get better, you can challenge yourself by turning the subtitles off.
Okay, we've covered listening, building confidence, even this mimicking thing. But what about the nitty-gritty stuff? Like vocabulary and grammar.
Well, the source doesn't shy away from that either. For vocabulary, they recommend focusing on what are called high-frequency words. These
Mm.
are the ones you hear most often in, like, everyday conversations.
So basically the words that'll get me actually speaking and interacting, rather than getting stuck on something I might never actually use.
Exactly. And remember, good old flashcards. Still a great way to memorize new words, especially when you're starting out.
Old school, but it works. But what about grammar? Can't escape that forever.
The key is to practice grammar in context. Don't just memorize rules in isolation. The source suggests using those grammar concepts you're learning in real sentences.
So instead of just drilling like verb conjugations, I could try making a sentence like, I am currently practicing my English grammar. That way I'm actually using it.
Exactly. Makes it stick.
Speaking of sticking, what about pronunciation? Some of those sounds in English can be real tongue twisters.
This is where those language chameleon skills come in handy again. The source really encourages you to pay close attention to those tricky sounds. For example, the 3 sound, which doesn't exist in a lot of languages, or the R sound, which can be, rolled or pronounced differently depending on the accent.
Oh, yeah, those are the ones that always trip me up. And then there's word stress and intonation, which I know can completely change the meaning of what you're saying.
It's like adding punctuation to your speech. The way you emphasize certain words or syllables can convey emotion or even like subtle shades of meaning.
It's almost like a secret code. The source mentioned something about online resources for practicing pronunciation. What are some of the recommendations?
While there's tons of stuff out there, it's amazing. You've got YouTube tutorials that break down specific sounds, language learning apps that'll actually give you feedback on your pronunciation, even online dictionaries that have, audio pronunciations for every word.
Wow, it's really incredible how technology has changed language learning. There's like a whole world of resources out there. But with so many options, it can be kind of overwhelming to know where to begin. Any tips from the source on how to navigate all that?
Well, they encourage exploration. Try out different apps, experiment with different methods, and just see what works best for you. Some people really thrive on structured lessons, while others prefer something more immersive and game-like.
It's about finding what fits your learning style. But beyond the apps and the online resources, what's that one piece of advice that the source keeps coming back to?
It's the power of repetition. Listen to this episode again. Revisit the key concepts. Practice those phrases and words until they just become second nature. Think of it like learning a musical instrument or training for a marathon. It's the consistency, the dedicated practice that ultimately leads to mastery.
So it's not just about passively listening or reading. It's about actively engaging with the language,
Right.
repeating those sounds, those patterns, those words until they become like ingrained in your brain.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to get creative with it. Record yourself speaking, sing along to English songs, even just try writing, short stories or journal entries. The more you interact with it, the more confident and fluent you'll become.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are you taking away from this journey? What sparks your curiosity? What will you try differently? And who will you share your newfound confidence with? Remember, every step you take, every word you learn, brings you closer to fluency. The world of English awaits. Happy exploring. All right, so we're back, and I gotta say, going through all this, I'm feeling pretty pumped about all the tips and strategies we've uncovered. It's like we've got this like roadmap to fluency.
You know what I really like about the stuff we're looking at is it's not just throwing information at you. It's like it actually guides you step by step. It reminds you that learning a language, it's a journey, not a race.
Yeah, it's like that moment when you finally get behind the wheel after studying the driver's manual.
Hmm.
You gotta actually get out there and drive.
Exactly. It's about taking all that knowledge and putting it into practice. And the best part is, it doesn't have to be this high pressure thing. Start small, like ordering food, asking for directions, just chatting with someone friendly at a local market.
Right, those little everyday interactions. That's where the magic happens.
Totally. It's when you realize, hey, I can actually use this to connect with people.
But what about those times when you're not surrounded by native speakers? How do you keep that momentum going?
Well, that's where this idea of immersion comes in. And the source makes this really great point. You don't need to book a plane ticket to immerse yourself. It's about creating an English speaking environment wherever you are.
Ah, I get it.
Yeah.
So crank up those English tunes, binge those British sitcoms, maybe even switch your phone settings to English.
Exactly. Surround yourself with it. The more you do, the more natural it's going to start to feel.
Okay, I love that. But I think even with practice and immersion, there's still this like underlying fear that I'll never really master English.
Yeah.
It feels like this elusive goal.
One thing that all these sources emphasize is that it's not about reaching a finish line. It's an ongoing process. It's a lifelong adventure, really. And I think that's actually pretty liberating because it takes the pressure off perfection.
So instead of beating myself up over every mistake, I should just enjoy the journey.
Right. Celebrate those aha moments and just appreciate the progress, no matter how small.
Okay, so focus on the positive.
Hmm.
But even with that, I think we can both agree that English can be tricky, right?
Oh, definitely. But don't forget about all the incredible resources that are out there, especially now. The source talks about language learning apps, online dictionaries, you've got pronunciation tutorials, even virtual conversation partners.
It's amazing how technology has transformed all this, right? But with so many options, it's almost overwhelming. Any suggestions on how to, navigate all of that?
They basically just encourage exploration, try
Yeah.
different apps, experiment with different methods, and just see what clicks for you. Some people love structured lessons, others want something more immersive and game-like.
Right, so find what fits your style. But beyond all the apps and resources, what's that one piece of advice, the golden nugget, that the source keeps coming back to.
It's the power of repetition. Listen to this episode again. Go back over those key concepts, practice those phrases and those vocabulary words until they just become second nature to you. Think of it like, practicing a musical instrument or training for a marathon. It's the consistency, the dedicated practice that ultimately leads to mastery.
So it's not just about passively absorbing information, it's about actively engaging with it.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to get creative. Record yourself speaking, sing along with some English songs, even try writing short stories or journal entries. The more you interact with it, the more confident you'll become.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into English for beginners. We've covered a lot of ground, from pronunciation and grammar to the importance of practice and immersion and those essential first phrases to get you started. So what are you taking away from all this? What are you most excited to try? Remember, every step you take, every word you learn brings you closer to fluency. The world of English awaits. Happy exploring.